Institute's annual celebration of the life and legacy of Milton Friedman. Nearly 4 years have gone by since Milton Friedman passed in November of 2006 at the age of 94. One of the most influential economists of the last century, Friedman was a leading advocate of free markets and libertarian ideas. And he was a relentless debater, perhaps one of the things he's most well known for as a personal matter. At one faculty party, an unfortunate opponent tried to escape a debate by getting up and leaving the room. Friedman pursued him. He darted between several people, stepped on the seats of an empty couch, holding his drink in one hand, bracing himself on the back of the couch with the other, vaulted over the couch onto the floor so he could cut off his hapless opponent and continue correcting him. It was said to be the sort of scene that you only expect to see in an action movie. In 2002, President George W. Bush spoke at a ceremony honoring Friedman on the occasion of his 90th birthday. And you can bet, at lunch at the White House, at least so the story goes, Friedman told George W. Bush exactly what he thought about Bush's unpaid-for tax cuts. We miss Milton Friedman, perhaps today more than ever. In light of the financial crisis of 2007 and its still ongoing aftermath, it's especially important that we pause at events such as this one, hosted by the Show Me Institute, to remember the lessons that Friedman tried to teach us. Lessons about markets and freedom, but also lessons about market failure. The Chicago economists you hear talking today sometimes seem to believe that there's no such thing as a market failure, even as they look around at the current environment. Milton Friedman knew better. It's because of the market failure of sluggish price adjustment that Milton Friedman thought it very important for economic welfare to keep the flow of nominal spending in the economy stable. Milton's preferred tool for keeping the flow of nominal spending in the economy stable was monetary policy, of course. And though he was very suspicious of the power of fiscal policy, in true emergencies, it is indeed the case that Friedman believed both banking and fiscal policy have due place. He used to quote the advice approvingly that his teacher Jacob Viner gave to policymakers during the Great Depression. And he noted that when bank operations don't suffice to countervail a contraction in credit, the federal government should increase its expenditures or decrease its taxes. Let us not forget the lessons Milton Friedman, all of them, tried to teach us. Lessons about markets, market failure, and about freedom of choice. So once again, welcome to the Show Me Institute's celebration of the life and legacy of Milton Friedman, and enjoy.
I'm Rex Singfield, the president of the Show Me Institute, and I just want to also welcome you here. First of all, you might notice some interesting centerpieces. Those are books, and they represent some of the books that the Show Me Institute Book Club has been going through or will be going through. And some of them, as you can see, are rather arduous tomes. If you are interested in any of those, they're not free. You can pay for them. We believe in free markets here. Free markets come with a price. But see Eric Dixon. There's Eric Dixon, the editor of the Show Me Institute, and I'm sure he can arrange a good free market transaction. Now, secondly, would all of the staff and any board members of the Show Me Institute, would you just stand up for a minute so everybody knows who you are? You don't have to go around and say who you are, but... Thank you. I want to thank, as Bonnie Wilson did, I want to thank St. Louis University for providing what is just an unbelievably beautiful space for this event. You know, we've had now at least a couple years now a cooperation with St. Louis University in the Show Me Institute St. Louis U speaker series, and we've benefited by having some outstanding speakers like Steve Levitt of the University of Chicago, co-author of Freakonomics, Dr. Jeff Marone of Harvard University, Carolyn Hawksby, formerly of Harvard, now Stanford, and these have been fabulous, and I hope you can make it on November 30th. It will be an outstanding speaker. He is president of the New Russia Party, trying to spread freedom and free markets in Russia. His name is Garry Kasparov, and you probably know him as the former world chess champion. He was champion for 15 years and the youngest person to ever become world champion at the age of 22. And if we have time, I'll give him a few pointers on how to play chess. We have a terrific program today, and we're actually going to start it at this moment. And I would like to welcome the moderator, Joe Haslag. Joe is a professor of economics, chaired professor of economics at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and he is the chief economist of the Show Me Institute. Professor Haslag.
Thank you for showing up. This is odd. I'm not used to having a mic, and I'm used to walking around a lot. I'll do that in a minute, and I'll also take my seat over there. Thanks for coming. This is, as Rex sort of mentioned, I think the 4th or 5th year that we have honored Professor Friedman on his birthday, thanks to a grant from the Friedman Foundation and to the hard work of the staff here with the Show Me Institute to put this together. There's a number of ways to try to encompass one person's life. We're going to take one stab at this today. One of the things about an economist, especially one who is as tremendously gifted as Professor Friedman is, you think you know a little bit about everything. Well, he actually did know a lot about a lot of different topics and was extremely gifted in being able to articulate that. That's one of the special gifts that elevated him to the point where he was beloved not only by his students, although some of them had rough goes with him, some of the graduate students did on times, beloved because of his ability to take highly complex interactions among you and I and translate them into simple ideas and articulate them in a way that he could convince you that he understood the world in a very elegant way, and that you should listen to him. He covered a lot of topics, and so what we're going to do today is bring together a panel, and each panelist is going to come up with some particular aspect of the breadth that Professor Friedman covered, and in doing so try to illuminate with you or share their ideas and their insights about how important his contributions were to that particular area. There's a couple of, you can call them house cleaning things that I would like to go over as well. One of the things about honoring Professor Friedman, and one of the things that the Friedman Foundation has given the Show Me Institute in the past few years, are funds to conduct studies. So there's actually a study that's coming out today. Actual Pay, a survey of Missouri public school superintendent salary and benefit packages. This was a paper that was started several years ago, involved lots of Freedom of Information Acts. Is Audrey here? Audrey's traveling. So one of the authors, Audrey Spalding, member of the Show Me Institute staff, was very involved in putting together these Freedom of Information Acts. So you're going to see an analysis and a description of what we know about the, I always get the number wrong. Mike, is it over 500 school districts in the state of Missouri? He's going to nod for me, yeah. Over 500 school districts and what they pay their superintendents and how they pay them. So they're eventually will have actually copies of their contracts. Now you might ask, well, why are we digging that way? We're not trying, this isn't a gotcha moment. This is just a further illustration of the transparency that we would expect of the government that exists at the state level. A couple of other points that I'd like to direct you to as you, along the lines of transparency that the Show Me Institute has been involved in. If you go to www.showmeliving, that's all sort of scrunched up into one word, showmeliving.org, there's a couple of applications that have been developed over the last 12 months by the Institute staff and various economists, which aims to add to this notion of transparency. I'll give you a more precise example. If you've ever gone to the Missouri State Government portal and you've tried to navigate your way through that portal, a very good idea that was initiated under Governor Blunt's administration, but the portal was aimed to sort of allow you to track spending by the state government at almost the individual level, certainly at the program level and at the individual level. Well, I think what has happened at the Show Me Institute is we've taken that portal and made it far more accessible. So if you go to showmeliving.org, you can take that for a trial run and you can see how different levels of spending, where your dollars are going, the dollars that you pay to state government. So if you're interested in how much was spent on historic preservation tax credits or how much was spent on specific programs, this is an easy way to do that. I think a very navigable way to do that. The other one that I'm extremely proud of is taking, if you've ever read, almost on an annual basis, certainly the last 3 or 4 years, Dr. Arthur Laffer, who was the architect of the supply-side tax cuts that were undertaken during the Reagan administration. Dr. Laffer has been working on books, usually with Stephen Moore, sometimes with other people, where he collects data across states. Well, we took that idea and kind of put it on steroids. So not only do we have more variables across states, if you're interested in measures of tax collections by various categories, property taxes, state income taxes, corporate income taxes, a variety of other spending measures at the state level, just some basic demographic and economic measures of those data. We've collected those not only for the state of Missouri, but for all 50 states, not only for all 50 states for 1 year, but for all 50 states for, in some cases, as long as 30 years. So the economics professors in the room, if you're not affiliated with the Show Me Institute and you're looking for your students to go out and do some data collection and sort of understand the world around them by looking at evidence, this is just a phenomenal way to introduce them to the economic data that exists. For the rest of us, if you just want to see how California compares to the state of Missouri on a certain dimension, this is a very easy way to do that. It's got graphical features built in, so if you want to chart certain things across time, you're capable of doing that. So I urge you to go again to showmeliving.org and to look at the IDEAS, IDEAS application as well and get that.
Thank you. I don't know what he said about me because we were working on this stuff, but it was probably right. So I got assigned the topic of education because that's what I do, but and we said talk a few minutes, but I'm going to use a couple of my minutes to comment more generally. All of us do teaching, and I read Capitalism and Freedom when I was a grad student. As Susan will say, a far left graduate student way back, and I went away from it. I saw much of the Friedman series, Free to Choose, but about 5-6 years ago, a professor in the history department was teaching a course on intellectual history, and he was having students, among the many books he was reading, 20th century intellectual history, having them read Friedman. And he asked me to come in and do a guest lecture. So I reread Capitalism and Freedom after 25 years, having read it the first time. And it was really extraordinary to pick it up again and read it. And if you haven't, I'd encourage you to read it. Because what's striking, of course, it's very well written, very elegantly written, really, tightly logical book. But he lays out a lot of ideas at that time. It was written, I think it was published in '61. And it's extraordinary how much the world has moved towards the ideas he laid out. So he was writing this book in a world in which, financial services were tightly regulated, surface transportation, air transportation, fixed exchange rates, and on and on. So he talks about privatization of Social Security, a whole lot of ideas that were just really seen as very far out at the time. And it's surprising how much what he argues in here, which was seen as so extreme at the time, has become much more accepted, much more commonplace. It shows the power of ideas. It didn't happen overnight, but gradually people began to appreciate the market kind of arguments he made. So it's a great book to read, and I'd really encourage you to do it if you haven't. Okay, so I was asked to talk about education, and one of the things that one of the chapters in Capitalism and Freedom, and one thing that Friedman wrote about quite a bit and talked about was the role of government in education. And Friedman argues, and I'm going to focus in his discussion in the book, he talked about both higher ed and K-12. I'm going to focus on K-12 in my remarks. Friedman lays out, he always starts from first principles, and he said, why do we subsidize K-12 education? And he lays out kind of the traditional arguments. And he talks about neighborhood effects. He gives a variety of reasons, but one of the most important he comes down on is neighborhood effects, which is what we'd call externalities. I'm better off if you are well educated. In a democratic society, we need an educated public. But what he points out is he said, look, just because there's a strong argument for subsidizing K-12 education, there's not a strong argument for the government producing most of it. And the fact is, right now, the government produces 90% of K-12 education. About 90% of kids are in traditional public schools. So he talks about he talks about the nationalized schooling sector. And if you think about other sectors like housing, food, medicine, we have subsidies there, right? We have housing vouchers, we have all kinds of increasing government intervention in medicine, but still most of it is still produced by private firms, either for-profit or not-for-profit. But in education, the government has a much larger role. And so he kind of takes on the argument is why do we do this? And he concludes that there isn't a good case, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. But he laid out what at the time seemed like a really far-out idea, which was vouchers for K-12 education. Say, look, there's a good case for subsidy, but we should voucherize this and let individuals make their own choices. And these vouchers could vary with income. Lower income folks could get higher vouchers. They could vary with need. Special needs kids could get higher vouchers. And he also felt in here and elsewhere that you would want individuals to be able to add some of their own money, because if they have skin in the game, they'll be better consumers. They'll pay attention to what they're buying and insist on quality. Now, why does this? So what do we get out of choice in terms of K-12? Well, I'd argue, and Friedman argues, that this is, if you think about this sector, this is one sector where it's pretty clear that one size doesn't fit all. And clear illustration of that is the private school sector. So we've had private schools that long predate public schools. And if you look at that sector, it's all over the place. The kids learn how to read, and they learn math, and they learn civics, but they do it in very different ways. I mean, you got Montessori schools, and Waldorf schools, and Lutheran schools, and Catholic schools, and military academies, and a whole independent sector. So why is this a positive thing? Well, basically, you've got a market here where on the demand side, parents and children have different preferences and needs. Parents, and you have on the whole, very well-informed consumers who know what they want. And then on the other side, it allows you schools to specialize. These private schools have a mission. They say, look, if it's a Montessori school, this is what we do. Here's the Montessori approach. Here's our philosophy. Here's how we do it. If you want to teach in this school, if you're a teacher and you want to do Montessori, you go to a Montessori school and teach. So it works on the labor market side too. And so it allows this kind of sorting, you know, in this kind of a market with these sort of very idiosyncratic kind of consumer preferences, and then idiosyncratic kind of producers. And of course, higher ed's very similar to this sort of another example of this. You can have big universities and small universities and so on. So there's a lot of reasons why, especially in a market like this, that you would expect choice to work, and there's a good case for choice. So I want to keep my remarks short here, but let me just say a word on research. In the time since Friedman wrote Capitalism and Freedom, we've had a lot of experiments in choice. We've actually have voucher programs and given students vouchers and given them some opportunities to attend private schools and Catholic schools. What do we know from this research? Well, in my own reading, and we can talk about this in question and answer, the research on private schools, which is primarily on Catholic schools, is almost uniformly positive, particularly for urban students and particularly for poor kids, minority kids. That there's a large body of research that tracks kids forward, and when kids get the opportunity to attend primarily Catholic schools, you found positive effects. There's been a few studies of vouchers, direct studies of vouchers, and these actually were randomized studies. That is, these are situations where there was an excess demand for the vouchers, and kids were randomly accepted into the program. So you've got something that actually is a randomized study. So you track the kids that didn't get in, you track the kids that did. And most of these studies have been quite positive, particularly on high-stakes outcomes like graduation. So we can talk about that. So this idea, my reading of the evidence, and I don't think this is controversial, on vouchers and Catholic schools and the private school sector is pretty positive, that it has worked where it's been implemented. Now the other strand, the whole school choice thing kind of went off in another direction with charter schools. Because of much objection, and it didn't have to do with economics, but sort of Blaine Amendment arguments, separation of church and state. Vouchers were seen as unconstitutional, or at least not acceptable. And so you got some of these public school choice experiments where the evidence is a little more mixed. We have a lot of charter schools in St. Louis and Kansas City. There's some newer studies that are looking at charter schools that have waiting lists. The charter schools have to let kids in a random way when you have a waiting list. And in those kind of studies, you generally tend to find positive effects, and sometimes very large positive effects. But as a whole, it's a little bit more mixed, and Show Me has a nice survey of the research in this area. But if you think about it, it's kind of an odd way we introduce choice, and it's really not surprising because most of these charter schools are new, they're startups. And so what we did with this charter school experiment is we excluded the seasoned players from the market. The Catholic schools, the Lutheran schools, that have been around for a century. And we got a bunch of new startups, some of which are been very successful, like KIPP schools and so on. Others have had a mixed record. So at any rate, the bottom line is, and we can talk about the choice experience, is ideas do matter. Friedman began talking about this 40 years ago. Choice, I think now, in terms of K-12, is pretty well accepted. You know, I think most everyone agrees, even sort of bipartisan, that parents should have choice about the schools they attend. There's disagreement about whether Catholic schools should be in that choice set. But you know, these ideas about free markets have really made a lot of advancement in this area in ed policy, and I'll leave it at that a lot of it came from Friedman and his students. Well, the best is, the gold standard in these studies is when you have random assignment to a treatment and control group. And you're getting a number of studies, including a big one that was just supported by the U.S. Department of Education of the DC voucher program, which Congress recently eliminated, which found generally positive effects. So the research has become more and more sophisticated, and we're getting more and more studies that have this randomized design where, you know, you're randomly assigned to a treatment or control group. Treatment meaning you get vouchered in, or a control, you don't. No, that's a very good point, and that was on my yellow sheet. I just ran out of time. In all of these cases, yeah, it's short. I mean, I actually wrote down a couple numbers here. You know, even if you end up with no difference in student achievement, for example, St. Louis Public Schools is spending almost $16,000 a student in current costs, whereas the charter schools here are spending a lot less than that. Confluence Academy, at most recent numbers, 08, $9,000 a student. Lift for Life, about $9,900. So, you know, in these voucher cases, the vouchers are always much less than what the public schools are spending. So, yeah, that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Just a personal aside, Mike was chairman of the economics department at MU when I was hired at MU in 2000. And as a faculty member, you learned that when you were making an argument trying to convince Mike that you needed more money or more resources, one of the things you always tried to was to keep things off of his yellow pad. He can remember those, but the rest wasn't so good. Thank you, Mike, for your insights. Let's move on. Professor Susan Feigenbaum is now going to share her insights on Professor Friedman's work.
Okay. Before I begin, I want to thank the Show Me Institute for inviting me today to share some comments with you. I happen to be somebody who believes very strongly in recognizing and remembering those intellectual giants upon whose shoulders we stand, both out of respect for them, and secondly, from a more narrow efficiency viewpoint, in the sense of why reinvent the wheel when it's been invented so well in the first place? I had the pleasure of interacting with Professor Friedman in the late 80s, early 90s, as we debated and disagreed on solutions to the healthcare crisis. I happen to be somebody who, beyond Wisconsin, has been brought up in the libertarian tradition of Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, and our views somewhat differed from Professor Friedman's, who believed that by getting rid of the tax deductibility of health insurance, you would solve the healthcare crisis. We disagreed with that from a moral hazard standpoint, and I'm happy to speak about that more later. But I have always, as Mike said, had a tremendous respect for Professor Friedman. Perhaps it's because he was just another short Jewish economist like myself. But Professor Friedman influenced my thinking in a very important way that I'd like to talk about, and as Mike did, I brought Capitalism and Freedom today, and hope I can share a few of his words with you, and that is in the area of discrimination. Some of you recall Milton Friedman's own personal history. He came into academics at a time when Jews and other minorities were not particularly welcomed in an overwhelming number in many East Coast, many Ivy League institutions. And Friedman migrated eventually with people like Aaron Director to the University of Chicago. And one of the things that we've certainly seen from the University of Chicago over the last decades is that it became the single greatest source of Nobel laureates in economics. This is quite intriguing as a piece of evidence in support of Milton Friedman's views on capitalism, free markets, and discrimination. What Professor Friedman argued in Capitalism and Freedom, and I might add, this came out, as some of you may know, in the early 60s, and it probably is the most important collection of essays in economics since David Hume's essays of 3 centuries before.
Long time ago.
Long time before. And what Milton Friedman argued was that free markets separate economic efficiency from characteristics unrelated to productivity in the labor market, to willingness to pay in the consumer market. So what did he mean by this? Well, one example he would give would be, does anybody ask who's built the car you're driving? Okay, well, we may have some international issues there, but if we're talking about the Ford plant or we're talking about Chrysler or whatever, is anybody asking, was it a minority building my car? Was it an immigrant building my car? Right? In a capitalist society, in free markets, okay, what we find is that individuals are blind with respect to, in effect, who produces output in an economy. All right? And as a result, in those kinds of competitive worlds, in labor markets, we would expect that employers would want to hire the most productive people available. All right? If they don't, then we know, again, in competitive markets, that they will suffer in terms of their profitability because they have, in fact, indulged themselves in certain characteristics and certain consumables, characteristics of their labor force, and thereby reduce their profitability. So his argument was that if we look at well-functioning markets, we tend to see that they compete away discrimination, particularly in labor markets. Now, in his discussion of discrimination, Milton Friedman showed a side of himself, a very normative side, opinionated side of himself, much beyond the general view of Friedman that of commitment to economic and civil freedom. And I just want to quote for you a very strong statement he makes, which is one reason that I respected him so much. He said, "I believe strongly that the color of a man's skin or the religion of his parents is by itself no reason to treat him differently. That a man should be judged by what he is and what he does, and not by these external characteristics. I deplore what seem to me the prejudice and narrowness of outlook of those whose tastes differ from mine in this respect. And I think the less of them for it." All right. So Friedman clearly, by his own statement, is somebody whose goal was for all men and women to be judged based on their actions and not on characteristics that were unrelated to their actions and to their productivity. Why did he believe that competition would reduce discrimination? As I just mentioned, one of the reasons is productivity. That is, that in a competitive market, suppliers would be attracted to the most productive individuals possible for their labor force. And secondly, that if you're a seller in a competitive market, and that's the if in a competitive market, that you would want to sell your products to anyone with a willingness to pay for your product. That is, you would not want to exclude demand for your product. If you did, you would have less revenue, you would have a lower bottom line. All right. So he believed that where discrimination arose in marketplaces, it arose when you had monopoly, when you had uncompetitive markets. There was another place, of course, where he believed that discrimination arose and was long-lasting, and that was where it had the benefit of government support. We saw this in South Africa. We saw this in the south of this country, where government laws, whether they were Jim Crow laws or other laws, enforced, in a sense, segregation in the labor force, in the workplace, and in the consumer market. Right? And so he was very concerned that whereas we might look to government, or some individuals look to government to protect us from discrimination, he was more concerned that more likely this kind of government power would protect, would enforce, all right, would continue discrimination, as some of these examples suggest. I might add Nazi Germany, and I think that that was very much on Friedman's mind. Of course, it was on Hayek's mind, and the way in which discrimination was institutionalized in that government. Another thing that Friedman talks about in this regard is that he appreciates, he's not a Pollyanna in this regard. He appreciates, understands that people have different preferences, that people have different tastes, and that those preferences and those tastes don't simply apply to the lunch you're eating today, the clothes you like to wear, the type of umbrella you like to carry, but that those preferences may well extend to what we might label prejudice about other individuals and the characteristics of other individuals. His argument, however, is that one of the responses, the major response to this, has to be education, has to be a cajoling, a debate, a discussion, experience, in order to change people's preferences. And in many ways, he parallels Adam Smith in this regard. I always find it interesting that when you ask people about Adam Smith, the first thing, of course, they'll say is Wealth of Nations. Well, many of us recognize that his volume before that was the theory of moral sentiments. Adam Smith understood that society had to create institutions within communities to influence the preferences, to influence the perspectives of individuals, all right? The morality, if you will, of individuals. And Friedman follows this quite a bit in talking about the important role there is in education and in breaking down barriers on a social level. But what he is really arguing is if you empower government, okay, to prohibit discrimination according to certain characteristics, all right, what does that mean about other characteristics that may be the basis for quote-unquote discrimination? There's been a lot of studies out that show, for example, that the taller you are, the thinner you are, the more symmetric your face features are, the higher your wage. All right, and the question becomes, how do we, in a sense, compete those kinds of preferences out of the marketplace? And his argument is the best way to do that is by having individuals measured by their productivity, having competitive labor markets, having competitive output markets. He did understand that, as Bonnie mentioned in the beginning, that sometimes we're in a second-best world. He did understand that there could be monopoly. He did understand that in the case of desegregating a counter at a lunchroom, there may be issues of what we call first movers. Who is it that does this first, and what kind of costs might they bear by being the first one to integrate the countertop? He also understood that there were second-best outcomes, okay, when it came to government. And in fact, if you read through Capitalism and Freedom, he is a very staunch supporter of a government role, which is enforcing private property, primarily. The one area that, and I'll close with this, the one area that Professor Friedman came to late in the game, but I must say it was a welcome coming, had to do with the lineage I somewhat descend from, and that is the public choice lineage in Virginia. And that is that it was not until fairly late in his career that he began to appreciate and understand interest groups and their impact on the political process, on the allocation of private property, on the enforcement, or lack thereof, of private property, and on reallocation of private property. And so late in his life, he became even more skeptical of the role of government in fighting what is generically termed discrimination. The last preface that Milton Friedman wrote for Capitalism and Freedom occurred in 2002, in which he was praising the move of the United States and the world in general from centralized economies with the fall of the Soviet Union to more reliance on the free market. I suspect that he is rolling over in his grave today to see how we have pushed back from those achievements that he had acknowledged in the early 2000s. I know Dan's going to talk about monetary policy, but clearly our move toward centralizing, once again, our economy, whether it be in healthcare, whether it be in certain environmental directions, is clearly at odds with the Friedman legacy. And again, that is a legacy not only of economic efficiency, but of economic freedom and civil freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let's take a question.
Okay, I'm interested, I like your discussion about discrimination in the free markets and productivity, but I'm interested in what you have to say about like the service sector, where productivity can really be based on things like how symmetrical a person's face is or how tall they are, because a person like that is more likely to be able to sell something to somebody, or people are more likely to go to somebody because they're more attractive, or they're white, or they're straight, or whatever it is that people believe in. So how do you sort of address that as an issue?
I think that's a good question. I think if Friedman were here today, Friedman would say, look, in a competitive market, and he spoke about this in the area of schools, and I should have mentioned this. He said, hey, if you had school choice, you might end up with some schools that are segregated and some schools that are integrated. And, this is a result of people's preferences, of consumer preferences, just as we have sports figures that are paid, 150 times what great college professors are paid. And the goal is, of course, to change these preferences. One of the areas, again, of changing preferences, which I didn't mention, has to do with Mike's talk about school choice, and that is that if you think about stereotypes and you think about productivity and you think about all these things and you think about where those things are reinforced and how productivity evolves, it is in schools. And so it is not, I think, coincidental that he wrote about discrimination within the context of school choice, okay? Now, I will, of course, make an aside, and that is that when it comes to things like symmetric features and things like that, clearly there are markets that can contribute depending on the marginal productivity of those kinds of features.
That might be a good place to. We'll take some more questions, but let's move ahead and let Dr. Thornton talk about his views on what Milton Friedman contributed.
I'm very pleased to be here to talk a little bit about one of the giants in my profession, Milton Friedman. I never had the opportunity to meet Milton personally, but I did get to see him present and debate on a couple occasions, and he was indeed a fierce debater. My own personal experience was I got a master's degree from Arizona State in the late 60s, and at the time Milton Friedman, I was very interested in monetary policy and always have been. And Milton Friedman was kind of making some noise in terms of his idea that central banks could control inflation. Back in the 60s and even through most of the 70s, the common view among Keynesian economics, who were dominant and probably still are dominant in the profession, was that monetary policy had little to do with inflation and that the monetary authority couldn't really control inflation. It was fiscal policy and some other things that were more important. And he was making a case that monetary policy could control inflation, and inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, which is the great quote from Friedman. And at the time, I was reading the stuff and saying, yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. He's really, and all of my friends and colleagues were thinking I was a cuckoo. So I was the resident cuckoo at Arizona State for becoming a kind of a Friedmanite at a very early age. So what I've done is I was asked to talk about Friedman's impact on monetary policy. So what I've chosen to do is I'm going to talk about a lesson learned, well, sort of learned, and then I'm going to talk about a lesson that's not learned, and I think there are at least two. There are probably more, but at least two that I can think of that were not learned. I'm only going to talk about one of the two. And then I'm going to talk about the unintended consequences of kind of learning the first one and not learning the second one. All right, so that's kind of what my story is going to be. So the first lesson is based on the principle that Friedman had, which is that, as I've already said, inflation is always and everywhere monetary phenomenon, and its corollary, which is that central banks could control inflation. All right? Friedman was making these arguments in the 60s and early 70s, and basically not winning the debate is the way I would call it. But we had the very rapid inflation in the 70s, for those of you in the room who are old enough, and many of you are, to remember that. And then we had a chairman of the Federal Reserve who was remarkable, actually, by the name of Paul Volcker, who, when inflation got very, very high, really took charge and decided he was going to take steps to bring inflation down. Now, I really admire Volcker for that, but the truth is he didn't have a choice. He had to try to do something. Inflation was double-digit, it was unacceptably high, and he really had his back up against the wall, so to speak. Well, that experiment, as we know, worked. Inflation came down rather dramatically, and that convinced all the central banks around the world, basically, that monetary policy could, in fact, control the long-run rate of inflation in the economy. And so what do we have? Well, we have probably nearly every central bank in the world is either explicitly, many are explicitly, or implicitly, as in the case in the Federal Reserve, inflation targeters. So they all believe they can control inflation, and it's the dominant thing. So they did learn that lesson. However, Milton Friedman argued that you controlled inflation by controlling the money supply. It was linked to money supply, right? So, and he was advocating at the time in the late, in the 60s and late in the 70s, most central banks were operating on kind of what we call interest rate targeting. They were more concerned about interest rates than they were about monetary aggregates. And what do we have today? Well, we have every central bank in the world essentially targeting interest rates and paying almost no attention at all to monetary aggregates. So that's why I say it's a lesson that was, well, it was kind of learned. It was learned, but in some sense, maybe a main point of the lesson was still missed. So what was the lesson that was not learned? Well, Friedman was very, very skeptical of the ability of the central bank to affect the real economy. Right? So if the economy was in recession, Friedman was very skeptical of monetary policy having significant real effects on the economy. Right? And he argued that skepticism went in spades when he talked about fiscal policy. So he was very skeptical about either monetary or fiscal policy having any significant real effects, and in particular trying to fine-tune the economy using monetary and fiscal policy. The corollary to that was that attempting to do so could be dangerous, right? So if you try to stabilize the economy by trying to do something that you cannot do, right, you might actually cause the economy to become less stable, not more stable, right? So we have a lesson that was kind of learned in that most central banks now believe they can, in fact, control inflation. But nobody pays really any attention to monetary aggregates or to the balance sheets of central banks. We have the lesson that was not learned, which is maybe monetary policy can't really do too much to affect the economy. And now we have the unintended consequence. All right, so what's the unintended consequence? Well, the unintended consequence is that most central banks are, in fact, either implicitly or explicitly targeting inflation, right? And they set an inflation objective, and as long as everybody kind of knows what the inflation objective is, and they really believe that the central bank can, in fact, achieve the objective, then expectations kind of anchor the inflation rate. So the inflation rate turns out to be a lot more stable, right, than it would otherwise be, because the markets reveal transparency. Or the central banks have revealed what their inflation target is. As long as the market believes that the central bank can achieve that objective, and we had a demonstration, that was a very powerful demonstration in the US in the late 70s and early 80s, that we could do that, then what happens is you get inflation expectations that are anchored, right? So then what do? Well, inflation expectations are anchored, then you try to do what? You try to do more than you can do. All right, so I'm going to give you a couple examples. In response to the 2001 recession, the Federal Market Committee reduced the funds rate target. It targets something called the federal funds rate, which is an overnight rate, interbank rate that banks lend money to themselves in an overnight market. And they have a target for that. They reduced that from 6.5%, which it was in January 1 of 2001, to 1%, right, by June of 2003, right? 1% was then historically low, but of course the target now is what? Anybody know? Essentially zero, right? So we did better than 1%, we've gone to zero. So basically, and one other thing is I said, well, importantly, the rate was below 5.5% from April of 01 through February 6th to February of 06. That's a period of 4 years and 9 months. So 4 years and 9 months, it was below 4.5%. You're going, who cares, 4.5%? What's 4.5%, right? Well, a nominal interest rate has two components. It has a real component, which is the real rate of return, and it has an inflation expectations component, which is the component that reflects the rate of increase in the rate of depreciation in the value of the dollar over time. So if inflation expectations, if the inflation target of the Federal Reserve is, let's say, 2%, which it's widely believed that it is, and if the real rate of interest is, let's say, about 2.5%, because kind of that's average growth rate, a little less than the average growth rate of real GDP, then 4.5% says, well, that's kind of where you'd want to be in a kind of a steady state, right? So anything below that would be kind of an easy monetary policy, right? If you think of it in terms of interest rates, anything above it. So we kept monetary policy very easy for over 4 years, almost 5 years, right? And in fact, if you think about how low we were below 4.5%, we all went all the way to 1%, policy was extraordinarily easy if measured it by that metric, right, over the time. Well, why did we do that? Well, the 2001 recession was very mild. In fact, I didn't go look at historical data, but if you pull up the revised data, revised GDP, you can't hardly see the sucker, right? It's hardly not there, right? So basically, GDP had completely recovered, right, in 2001 by essentially almost the end of the year, beginning of 2002. It had completely recovered, right? So why did we keep the funds rate below some reasonable measure of a long-run equilibrium interest rate for another almost 4 years? And the answer was employment growth. Employment wasn't doing anything. In fact, employment, in the 2001 recession, employment was still falling. Not like today, it's actually turned around. It was still falling this past the recession, way past the recession. So what was monetary policy doing? It was trying to, right, increase employment growth. Well, I think that a lot of people would agree that monetary policy is probably particularly poorly suited for having any impact on employment. So what were we doing? Well, we were trying to do something we couldn't do because we had inflation expectations anchored, right? And in fact, if you read, which are now available online, by the way, the 2003 and 2004 transcripts of Federal Market Committee meetings, you will find that that's exactly what we were doing. In fact, Greenspan, who was chairman at the time, basically said, normally we'd be raising the rate right now, but as long as inflation expectations are anchored, we're not going to do anything. All right, so what was the unintended consequence? Well, one unintended consequence might have been it exacerbated the financial crisis. John Taylor and others argue that, and I've exchanged emails with John, I don't agree 100% with him, but I think there's some truth to it. John would argue that keeping the funds rate at 1%, which we did for an entire year, and keeping it well below an equilibrium for a long period of time, right, provided fuel for the housing market. I pointed out to John that mortgage rates really didn't go down, right? And then he pointed out to me that, well, the ARMs did. And it's true that the ARMs did fall. So there is some truth to the idea that certainly having that low could have exacerbated, I don't think it's the total culprit, but it could have exacerbated the growth in the housing industry and the subsequent, the housing bubble and the subsequent collapse of that bubble. All right. I would argue that whether it did or not, it's just not a reasonable monetary policy to pursue. All right, the second example is where we are now. All right, in response to the financial recession, we reduced the target from what it was at before the recession, which was 5.25%, 5.25%, to zero from September of 2007 to October of 2008. So we very aggressively reduced the target. In fact, the last changes in the target we basically had to make, but that's another story. And we've committed to basically say what? We're going to keep the funds rate at zero for the language in the directive is for an extended period, right? When we talk about it euphemistically around the shop, we say, for as far as the eye can see. All right, for some extended period, all right. And if you look at the which I just did, blue chip today, it looks like they're thinking it somewhere around 2013 we'll start raising the target for the funds rate. So if you believe that, so we're going to keep it at historically low levels. And the point is, we've already been in below 4.5%. For 2 years, 7 months, and we could certainly outdo our previous record. Moreover, we're further below any idea of a long-run equilibrium rate than we've ever been historically, right? What's the unintended consequence of that? Well, we'll have to live and see what that might be. But I would argue it's not reasonable monetary policy. We should be raising the target. We should be reducing the monetary base, which we increased massively, and we should be raising the target back up into at least in the area of around 2.5%, 3%, something more reasonable given the current conditions. And so I think Milton Friedman had a big impact on monetary policy in that every country now believes that central banks can control inflation. Unfortunately, because they didn't learn the other lessons, we're still in a bind. Thank you.
I should probably say this on Dan's behalf. The views expressed herein are not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis.
I forgot my usual disclaimer.
Yeah, right.
But it's pretty obvious.
We don't know whose arms Dan is twisting at the Board of Governors, so we'll wait to see how those unintended consequences
The views
play
are mine
out.
and not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, nor the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System.
Very good.
Thank you very much. I'd like to make this a two-part question. The first is, I never understood, and still today do not understand, Friedman's relationship with interest rates, since in my memory it's very fragmented. I'm not an economist. I think at some time that he came out in favor of maintaining a zero nominal rate, which I never understood. And I may be wrong on that, but the second part of my question is that clearly his monetary aggregate policy was counter-cyclical, to expand in times of retraction and to retract in times of expansion. Going further with your question on the unintended consequences of maintaining the low interest rate is another unintended consequence, and you hate to say this at any Friedman gathering, is that since the monetary policy bullet had been shot once the crisis hit us, whether it would have worked or not, it was shot, did that leave us with only fiscal policy, and therefore the monetary policy actually added to the argument of the fiscal policy, which I obviously think has gone too far?
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Friedman on rate. I mean, there are several things on Friedman on rate. One is, and I'll talk about it from the policy perspective, a lot of central banks were operating at interest rate. And Friedman's hypothesis was that you have no idea, right, of the degree of monetary constraint or monetary ease that's by looking at the nominal interest rate. So to take a kind of a standard story that Friedman would tell, let's assume that the interest rate is 4% and inflation goes up, right? And you're targeting 4%, inflation goes up. And you raise your target, let's say, to 4.5% or 5%, and you think you've had a move towards a more restrictive policy. But if in fact the inflation went up or inflation expectations went up by a full percentage point, your policy is exactly the same as it was before, right? So you haven't done anything. And his concern was that by targeting interest rates, you could actually get this dynamic instability kind of a situation going. So when you try to push interest rates down, you increase the supply of money and credit. As you increase the supply of money and credit, the inflation rate goes up. The inflation rate goes up, so that pushes nominal interest rates up, which means now you've got to do what? You've got to increase the supply of money and credit even more, which causes more inflation, causes interest rates, and you get in this situation where it's dynamically unstable. So that was a strong argument of Milton against using nominal interest rates as a tool for monetary policy, which of course is what we operate on today. In terms of, I'm not sure I quite understood the monetary fiscal question. Friedman was not a real strong proponent of countercyclical policy, period. He was a proponent of using money, changing the growth rate of money to stabilize the inflation rate, or to, as I think somebody said earlier, stabilize nominal spending, which is essentially the same kind of thing. So he was a strong proponent. He was not a proponent of fiscal policy at all for a number of reasons. Number one, he thought it was relatively ineffective. It wasn't going to have much impact. And then there's these, he had these recognition lag, the action lag, and the implementation lag, or something like that. So the recognition lag was, well, first of all, you got to see a policy. You got to see a problem before you can act, right? And then if your fiscal policy, right, if you see a problem, then you got to do some legislation, so that takes time, right? And then when you do the legislation, it takes time to implement it. And his idea was by the time you did all of that and you actually implemented the policy and it started having impact, right, the economy was already covering on its own. So now what? If it has an impact at all, it's going to cause the boom to be bigger. So if you have a bust and you do these things, you lead to a bigger boom and you get, again, instability associated. We have it in spades, of course, with the, with the stimulus package. About half of that money is still what? Unspent, right? So I think we're still looking at half the money being spent. I mean, we passed the TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Fund, in, at the 11th hour, because if we didn't pass it by Sunday night, Monday morning, the world was going to come to an end. We didn't do anything for like 3 months, or like 3 or 4 weeks. And then when we did it, we didn't do what we said we were going to do with the money anyhow. Right? That's hard to believe, guys. I mean, come on. That's really, really hard to believe that the world was going to come to an end if you didn't do it by Sunday night. And we did it, and then you didn't do anything, and guess what? The world's still here. It didn't end. Anyhow, I could go on, but I won't.
Good. Let's take one more question.
If you could put your prognostication hat on, our national debt right now is $13.5 trillion. And according to the administration, we should add another $4.5 trillion by your 2013 date. And we are financing that with short-term paper at virtually no interest rates. So the interest rate portion of our fiscal spending is pretty low historically. Could you comment on what that's going to look like in 2013 when interest rates start going up and we have $18 billion in debt, and now we got a new health care bill, which is what's going to happen then?
One thing that's happened is we've spent so much money and we've gotten ourselves in such a bind that we may actually have to finally do something. Right. So if you look at not only the U.S., but you look at it globally, all right, deficit to GDP ratios I did this for a briefing, so I kind of know. Deficit to GDP ratios for the European Union countries, right, has risen over, since 2007 dramatically. They've risen dramatically. Now, everybody's forecasting, including the United States, by the way, forecasting that would go down in 2010 and 11, right? That's not going to happen. It's probably not going to happen for any of them. All right? The debt to GDP ratios have also gone up dramatically. All right? For the ECB, for example, the average for the European Union countries was about 65% in 2007. And even with their forecast for 2011, it's like at 90% or near 90%. All right? The U.S. will probably be well over 100% debt to GDP ratio by 2011, if we're not over that number by 2010 when the actual numbers come in, right? Deficits to GDP ratios are projected to fall too, but if you look at those forecasts for the U.S., for example, when the average always turns out, if they're forecasting a surplus, the surplus always turns out to be smaller than the forecast, or almost always turns out to be forecast. And if they're forecasting a deficit, the deficit turns out to be larger. All right? So who wants to believe any of those numbers? Not me. I don't want to believe one of them. Because if I want to believe anything, I'm going to believe they're wrong in the direction that the deficit's going to be larger than they project. Right? So we are in a situation where we've got a whole bunch of countries around the world whose debt to GDP ratio and whose deficits to GDP ratios are in really the danger zone. Right? And that's all coming to roost very soon. And some of the countries have taken some steps. The UK, for example, has done some things, and fairly draconian by historical standards. We may be in a situation in the U.S. where politicians will do this because for the only reason they ever do anything drastic like that is they don't have a choice. Right? There are no other options available. Exactly the reason that Paul Volcker instituted the restrictive monetary policies that he followed beginning in late '79 quite frankly, he didn't have another alternative.
Please join me in thanking our panelists, Mike Podgursky, Susan Feigenbaum, and Dan Thornton. Thank you.